My name is Willow Brooks, 36 years old, Ph.D. in computer science and a specialist in covert financial system analysis. But that night, at a prestigious gala in New York, I was just a woman in a simple black dress, sitting silently in the last row, like a shadow lost among a sea of dazzling CEOs. An event coordinator approached, glanced at the badge on my wrist, then lowered her voice. Sorry, this area is reserved for senior executives. Administrative staff should be seated further back. That voice belonged to Cheryl, my cousin, once the founder of a billion-dollar fintech startup, the same person who used to introduce me to everyone as her assistant who types fast. She didn't recognize me, or pretended not to. I simply smiled and nodded quietly. 12 minutes later, the deputy director of the FBI stepped onto the stage, holding a microphone, his gaze sweeping across the now silent ballroom. We are honored to welcome Dr. Willow Brooks, the lead architect behind the operation that dismantled the largest tech-based money laundering network in the United States, to receive the Medal of Honor. The entire room went still. Cheryl dropped her wine glass, her face drained of all color. Have you ever been dismissed in the very place where you deserve to be recognized? Have you ever endured in silence, only to one day step into the light and quiet every voice around you? If this story touched something inside you, leave a comment so I know I'm not alone. Hit like if you believe the truth always finds its voice. Subscribe to this channel to follow the unexpected journey I've only just begun. I stood up, each step steady but deliberate, as if walking through the long years when I was treated like a shadow behind someone else. The ballroom held its breath. The only sound was the faint click of my heels on the polished wood floor, reflecting the golden stage lights. 2 FBI agents escorted me down the aisle, past the neatly dressed powerhouses of the tech world, suits perfectly tailored, gowns glowing under the chandelier, all staring in confusion, like they had just misheard something impossible. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on me, some curious, some skeptical, and some heavy with silent shame. Cheryl stood frozen on stage, her radiant smile from earlier cut short, her face stiff. I met her gaze, the same eyes that once looked at me like a servant, the same voice that had sent me for coffee, that told me I should be grateful to have a steady job, even if no one knows your name. I didn't say anything. I just gave a small smile, the kind I used to wear when being overlooked, a habit etched into my bones. But this smile didn't carry resignation. It was the silence of someone who had walked through fire and arrived without needing to shout. The deputy director waited until I reached the stage, then personally pinned the medal to my chest, right beneath the spotlight. As his hand rested on my shoulder, he leaned in and said, his voice low and gravelly, "They should have known your name long ago." I replied softly, just for him to hear, "They will now." I turned to face the audience. Faces stared back in disbelief, struggling to accept what they were witnessing. I glanced down at the main table, where Cheryl had returned to her seat, adjusting her posture like she was trying to salvage her image. The microphone crackled again. The deputy director's voice carried not in volume but in weight, like a verdict had just been read. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Willow Brooks is not just one of the leading experts in digital financial systems. She uncovered, decoded, and delivered the core evidence that brought down a tech-based money laundering network spanning 4 countries and involving over $200 million in illicit transactions. And the most remarkable part is that she did it in silence. For the past 8 years, murmurs rippled through the hall. People leaned toward each other in disbelief. Those who had eagerly shaken Cheryl's hand earlier now avoided her gaze. "We couldn't release this information earlier due to the operation's sensitivity," he continued. "But tonight, you all deserve to know. And Willow deserves the light." I didn't give a speech. It wasn't needed. My presence in a modest black dress, with the medal heavy on my chest, and eyes calm under the scrutiny of the elite, was the loudest response to years of dismissal. I left the stage as applause swelled behind me. No one had prompted it. No one had started it. But slowly, like waves of collective reckoning, people rose to their feet, one by one. The claps struck like hammers against the arrogance of those who once thought themselves untouchable. As I passed Cheryl's table, she sat with her head bowed, lips pressed tight. The glass of red wine in front of her hadn't been cleared, but the liquid inside, no. A longer trembled. It was completely still. I didn't look at her, but I knew the chaos was in her eyes now. After the ceremony, I returned backstage. A young receptionist approached me, looking uncertain. "Dr. Brooks, someone's waiting for you in the VIP lounge. Her name is Cheryl Maddox." I nodded slowly, took a sip from the glass of water on the table. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't cold. The emotion I felt wasn't triumph or anger. It was something more precise, like everything had finally returned to where it belonged. I walked into the carpeted lounge. Cheryl stood by the large window overlooking the city. She turned as the door opened. "Willow." Just that single word, but it carried a decade of things left unsaid. I didn't respond. I sat on a velvet armchair, crossed my legs, and set my glass on the side table. Cheryl approached but didn't sit. She stood across from me for a long moment. "You didn't need to do it like that," she said, her voice low and tense. "In front of the whole industry. The press. You've already won." I looked her in the eye. "You think this was a game?" Cheryl stayed silent. I went on. "Do you remember what you used to say when I wrote your pitch decks? Investment briefs? Cleaned up your algorithms? Do a good job, I'll thank you in the credits." I paused, blinking at her. "And you never did." "Willow, you know we were in survival mode. I had to prioritize funding. You were part of the team. I couldn't list everyone who helped. I was the team." My voice didn't rise, but each word landed with weight. "But I get it. You don't have to apologize. Because I didn't go on stage tonight to humiliate anyone. I stood there to remind myself that I'm no one's shadow anymore." We sat in silence. City lights spilled through the window across Cheryl's face, softening it somehow. She didn't look like the Forbes cover star anymore, not the speaker invited to Harvard. She looked small. "I used to think you'd never walk away," she whispered. "You were always so quiet." "I wasn't quiet," I said. "I was building something you never had the patience to see." Then the door opened. An FBI agent stepped in and nodded. "Dr. Brooks, the director is waiting upstairs." I stood, adjusted my blazer. Before I walked out, I turned back to Cheryl. "If you want a fresh start, begin by saying my name right. Not secretary. Not my cousin who types fast. Just Willow." I walked out of that room the way I had walked out of those long years, not to look back, but to step fully into where I belonged. 12 years ago, I lived in a tiny rental in Brooklyn. Winters were so cold the water from the tap stung. Summers so hot the ceiling fan gave out and never came back. I was a freshly graduated computer science student from a modest public university. No wealthy relatives, no connections, no Google offers or Ivy League scholarships. Just stacks of documents I typed every night to afford my mother's medicine. At that time, Cheryl, my cousin, had just secured a seed funding round worth $3 million to launch her startup. Her idea was a digital payment platform for small businesses, simple but timely, and led by a bright face with an MBA from Wharton. She called me one late afternoon. "Willow, I need a personal assistant. I think you might enjoy working in a fast-paced environment with lots of potential. The budget's tight for now, but I promise you'll learn a lot." I was silent for a few seconds. My mother had just been hospitalized for a mild heart attack. I needed money, I needed a job, and I needed someone to believe in me. I said yes. The personal assistant job started with answering phones, scheduling meetings, managing emails. But gradually, Cheryl began handing me folders, incomplete Excel sheets, broken lines of code. "Can you help me with this? I'm starting." Busy pitching. I fixed them. I rewrote them. I built the payment model in Python, integrated QR codes based on EMV standards. I even designed the data framework for analyzing customer behavior. Everything that later became the core product was built during nights I spent coding alone under a dim desk lamp, while my mother's labored breathing echoed from the folding bed behind me. Cheryl never asked how I was doing. Every time I sent a new draft, All I got was a short email. Good. I'll send this to the VC. Then came article after article praising the groundbreaking brilliance of the young female founder who had developed a proprietary multi-layered security mechanism. One time, I asked quietly, could I be listed as a technical contributor on the proposal? Cheryl looked up from her laptop and smiled. Willow, you're my cousin. Your family. Your name doesn't matter. I'm building a future for you, aren't I? I didn't say anything more. Because at the time, my future was the hospital, a 12-line prescription list, and a looming statement of unpaid tuition debt. I had no power to negotiate. Cheryl moved into a luxury penthouse after the second funding round. She traveled everywhere, giving startup talks, signing partnership deals with major financial institutions. Meanwhile, I still showed up to the office early every morning, made coffee, answered emails, then went home to code sections no one knew I wrote. One day, my mom had a high fever and was delirious. I asked to leave work an hour early. Cheryl frowned. Willow, this is a critical phase. You can't just disappear like that. If you want to go further in this industry, you need to be more professional. I stayed quiet. I was always the quiet one. One morning, I walked into the conference room carrying a revised product design I had spent a week refining. The room was packed, the whole team, senior investors included. Cheryl stood at the head of the table, her face radiant under the spotlight. We are proud to present the latest upgrade to our platform, the AI-driven transaction behavior analysis feature that I developed with our R&D team will open up a new direction for the market. I stood still. In the 20-minute presentation, not once was my name mentioned. No one looked at me. I was just part of the furniture. After the meeting, I pulled Cheryl aside in the hallway. About that AI feature? Willow, she cut me off. I know how you feel, but you have to see the big picture. You're still young. You don't fully understand how this industry works. Don't ask for credit if you're not ready to face the media and shareholders. I'm protecting you. That was when I knew I had to leave. That night, when I returned to my cramped apartment, I didn't eat. I just sat on the floor, opened my laptop, and wrote my resignation letter. But I didn't send it. I copied every technical file I had ever built, saved a backup, encrypted it with a personal string of characters. I told myself, I won't resign. I'll disappear in a way no one sees coming. 4 days later, Cheryl called me into her office. She smiled faintly and handed me a folder. The company is restructuring. I've prepared your termination papers. I'm offering you a 3-month severance if you sign here. I looked her straight in the eyes. No reason? I think we both know why. I signed. No tears. Only one thought echoed in my mind. If you want me to be invisible, then I'll be the shadow the whole world will one day be forced to see. And just like that, I left. No one said goodbye. No farewell post. No one in the office asked where I was going. They didn't know that night. I began writing the first lines of code for a completely new system. Not for Cheryl, not to beg for credit, but to start a journey I built with my own hands. I walked out of that office building unnoticed. No one saw me off. No one even looked up from their screens as I passed by. 4 years of silent dedication, no thank you, not even a glance. Just a legal document full of clauses and a cold signature. The non-disclosure agreement was 14 pages long. The terms were sharp as scalpels. Cheryl had hired a full legal team to draft it. The core clause was clear. I was forbidden from disclosing any contributions I made during the platform's development, barred from publishing any code or technical reports I had written, and banned from using any experience from that period to contest intellectual property rights. If I violated it, I'd face civil litigation and potentially owe millions in damages. I sat at the conference table, looking at the paper on the glass surface, pen in hand but unmoving. Cheryl sat across from me, her face calm, unwavering. It's for your own good, she said, her voice sweet as honey. I know you don't want legal trouble. You need stability. With the 3-month severance, you can rest and start fresh. I looked at her for a long time. Part of me wanted to speak. to throw every piece of code I had lost sleep over onto the table, to scream that I had built the core system behind the platform she was bragging about everywhere. But I did nothing. I signed. The sound of the pen meeting paper felt like a door locking shut forever. I stood, collected the box of personal items the office manager had packed. My old laptop, a notebook full of crossed-out notes, a small photo frame of my mother smiling in her hospital bed. No one said a word. Cheryl didn't walk me out of the room. I walked straight out of the building, past a few blocks to the subway station. It was spring in New York, the air cool, cherry blossoms blooming along the sidewalks. But I felt colder than the morning breeze. I didn't cry. My eyes were dry, like all my emotions had been pressed into the bottom of my chest. That evening, I returned to the small apartment I shared with an art student. My mother had passed away 8 months earlier. I had exactly $417 left in my account. No insurance, no home, no direction. But there was one thing: I still had an encrypted hard drive containing all the data I had ever created. I sat at the old wooden desk, opened my laptop, and logged into the offline programming environment I had set up from day one. All the source code I had written was still intact. The user behavior analytics scripts, the fraud detection system built on machine learning, the payment route recommendation algorithms based on transaction chains, all of it was mine. I opened a text file and named it Dandelion Alpha 1 TXT. And I wrote, not for revenge, but for reconstruction. A new system, independent, anonymous, with no borrowed names, no signatures but mine. I designed a virtual network capable of monitoring cryptocurrency transactions in real time, identifying suspicious behavior, and sending automated reports to a private inbox I secured through an anonymous encryption protocol. But what kept me going wasn't the code. It was the silence I had grown up with, and I chose it as my weapon. For the next 2 years, I worked part-time at a university library during the day and developed Dandelion at night. I lived frugally, ate instant noodles, rented cheap rooms, wore the same clothes, but I never stopped. I also studied intellectual property law on my own, learning to protect myself using the same legal language they once used to shut me down. I knew that to step into the world Cheryl now ruled, talent wasn't enough. I needed strategy, knowledge, and a level of patience most people never even imagined. Then one night, I received an email from an anonymous address. Subject: someone's using the payment platform as a front. The sender was a hacker going by the alias Northlight. He included a piece of code pulled from the back end of a fintech company called TetraPay, the new name Cheryl gave her company after the merger. It took me 2 days to decrypt it. When the full analysis loaded, I nearly dropped my coffee cup. Cheryl's system was being used to channel funds between illegal exchanges in Eastern Europe, with clear signs of international money laundering. What shocked me wasn't the scale, but the mechanism. It was a patch I had written 3 years earlier. I understood. She hadn't just stolen my work, she had built a global laundering network on top of it. I created a new file, Operation Dandelion. I extracted every line of data from TetraPay, identified weaknesses in the source code I had once written, and secretly reached out to someone I had met at a cybersecurity conference the year before, an FBI agent specializing in high-tech crime named Benjamin Cole. We met at a small cafe in Queens, tucked away in a quiet corner where no one would look twice. He listened to me speak, didn't interrupt, didn't rush. When I handed him the hard drive and the preliminary analysis, his eyes changed. "Are you sure about what you're telling me?" "I've never been more sure. I can't promise immediate action, but we'll investigate. If everything checks out, we'll need your cooperation." I nodded. "I don't want anything. I don't need credit. I just want it to stop." He studied me for a few seconds, then nodded. "I'll call you." And 3 months later, I got the first call from the Federal Investigations Office. The call began with 2 words. "Are you ready?" I smiled in my tiny rented apartment, in the quiet of the New York night. Ready. Because from the moment I signed that non-disclosure agreement, I had made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone bury me again. I'm not reclaiming the past. I'm rewriting it one line at a time in my own name. I returned to school that fall, when the leaves began to change color, not with the thought of starting over, but to prepare myself to enter a deeper layer of the world I had once only watched from the outside. Columbia University accepted me into a PhD program, specializing in data security and non-traditional finance. I chose the hardest path, the driest one focused on anonymous payment systems, unsupervised blockchain models, peer-to-peer networks in the darkest corners of the internet. I wasn't there to build trendy apps. I was there to understand how money disappears, gets laundered, then re-enters the market like it had never been stained. I kept my real identity quiet within research circles. To my classmates, I was just Willow, the quiet doctoral student who always sat in the back of the library, ate cold sandwiches for lunch, and wore noise-canceling headphones with no music playing. I didn't share anything beyond my dissertation. No social media, no clubs, but my computer was directly linked to a server system I built myself. I called it FrostLayer, a simulated ice layer that mapped how dirty money moved across virtual wallets, encrypted vaults, and fake intermediary organizations. And from FrostLayer, I started sending reports to an email address tied to a non-public FBI division. I never signed my name. I never left an identifying trace. I used only one code name, Whisperer. Each report was encrypted with 3 layers of algorithms. I included technical instructions, risk analysis, suggested actions. I never asked for a reply. But 1 month after my first report, a package arrived at my department's academic office. No return address. Inside was a thin envelope containing a single encrypted USB drive and one line on a folded sheet of paper. "Keep going. We need you." I understood. They had verified my technical signature and accepted me as a collaborator, even if we never met. From that moment on, I became part of a small, quiet network with far-reaching impact. We didn't use names only, code names and data. I sent system analyses from FrostLayer. They cross-referenced them with field intelligence. Slowly, virtual assets came under surveillance. Wallets tied to illegal holdings were frozen. Certain individuals were taken in for questioning. No one outside that circle knew what I was doing. I lived quietly, like any other student. But every time the headlines announced another money laundering ring shut down by the Treasury Department, I would sit in the dark, hand resting gently on my keyboard, and feel something I hadn't felt in years' worth. Cheryl didn't disappear. On the contrary, she became more famous. TetraPay, the rebranded version of the original startup, was expanding into international markets. Articles praised her as a fearless founder and a pioneer in digital transaction transparency. I tracked her every move, not out of spite, but to better understand what I had to dismantle. In my 3rd year of the PhD program, I discovered a chain of unusual transactions passing through 5 small exchanges in Eastern Europe. The signs were familiar, small volumes, but continuous and consistent. The IP address of one originating wallet traced back to TetraPay's office in Chicago. I froze. I reran the entire risk analysis model, mapped the fund flow. They were using the same behavioral algorithm I had written, the one I developed during early testing, now slightly modified and hidden under a new name, Smartwash Protocol. I printed a diagram, placed it on the center of my desk, stared at the arrows showing how money slipped past regulators. I saw my name not in letters but in the technical footprint, the encryption pattern, the variable structure, the loop mechanism. Unmistakable. She wasn't just using my work. She was using it to bypass the law. I knew I couldn't send another silent report. This was too big. I needed to meet face to face. And that's why I reached out again to Agent Benjamin Cole, the one I had once handed that first hard drive to. He had since been promoted, now leading a special federal unit focused on non-traditional financial crimes. We met in an unmarked building on the outskirts of Arlington, Virginia. He invited me into a small room with nothing but a plain wooden table and 2 glasses of water. No recordings, no phones. "Whisperer," he said with a slight smile. "What's your real name?" "Willow Brooks." He nodded. Are you ready to step into the light? I stayed silent for a moment, then replied, each word clear and steady. I don't need the light. I just want results. Then listen closely. He leaned forward. We're about to launch a multi-agency coordinated operation. If you can provide a detailed analysis, we can use it to obtain a warrant and freeze the system. I pulled a hard drive from my bag, encrypted with 4 layers, and placed it on the table. It's right here. He didn't rush. He just looked at me with a calm, unforced seriousness. We won't push you into the spotlight unless absolutely necessary. But if the time comes to stand before the public, I cut him off, gently but firmly. I'm not afraid of that. I'm only afraid of being silenced again. Benjamin's gaze lingered on me for a few seconds, then he nodded. Welcome back, Willow. I knew then that I was no longer a shadow. I was the one who had stepped into the darkness, quietly tracing every path they built with dirty money, and now I held the map. And I was going to bring it all into the light. Not through shouting, but with data, with truth, with something they couldn't ignore anymore. The hard drive I gave to Agent Cole wasn't just a technical analysis. It was the key to unlocking a complex underground network where money flowed through every loophole in the law, wrapped in the most sophisticated disguise modern technology could create. From the data recovered, the investigation team began reviewing transactions tied to a side project of TetraPay called NovaChain, publicly. NovaChain was marketed as an open financial platform using blockchain to help small businesses access global payment services. But deep in its encrypted layers were hundreds of intermediary wallets linked to black market exchanges in Ukraine, Serbia, and a branch in Cyprus. Everything operated through a split routing model, breaking transactions into thousands of fragments and bouncing them across multiple countries to blur the trail. I recognized the structure instantly. It was from code I had written years ago, then lifted and twisted by Cheryl into a tool that disguised hundreds of millions of dollars. The FBI assembled a multi-agency task force, coordinating with ICE and the IRS. I was invited to serve as an independent technical advisor. The name Dandelion was born during a brief midnight meeting after I presented a transaction branching diagram that resembled dandelion seeds, scattering yet always tracing back to the root. We need a clean cut, Cole said during the meeting. We can't just trace every single transaction. They're using anti-tracking algorithms. I answered without hesitation. I'll write a conditional attack script. It'll only trigger when 3 elements align: timing, wallet structure, and loop cycle. Are you sure you can crash the system without affecting the outside world? I nodded. The goal isn't destruction. The goal is to force the entire underground money flow to surface. Once the masking code is stripped, every hidden address will be exposed inside their own mandatory reporting system. 3 weeks later, the script was complete. I stored it on an isolated virtual server, protected by triple-layer authentication. Its name was Dandelion Trigger. With one single command, TetraPay's global payment system would be forced to redeclare every transaction that had passed through it. The launch date was set. The gala honoring the top 50 women in tech leadership, where Cheryl was scheduled to receive the award for Most Influential Female Leader of the Year. We didn't choose the day for symbolism. It was a cold, strategic decision. Every top executive, including TetraPay's infrastructure team, would be present at the event. They couldn't interfere remotely. And the system, designed to run on automation, would carry on unnoticed. I arrived at the venue early, posing as a representative from a nonprofit supporting women in technology. I carried my personal laptop, fully encrypted. On the way, I received a message from an unsaved contact. I've accessed the second encryption layer. Your original code remains undetected. Ready when you are, Northlight. I exhaled slowly, resting my hand on the screen. Northlight, the anonymous hacker who had approached me earlier, had now become the critical link. Over the past 3 months, he had infiltrated NovaChain's internal verification layers, allowing Dandelion Trigger to be installed as a routine security patch. Now, all we needed was the right moment. The gala was held at a major hotel in the heart of Manhattan. Under crystal chandeliers, Cheryl wore a deep red fitted dress, her face glowing. She moved from table to table, shaking hands with executives, chatting with investors, posing with high-ranking officials. No one knew that backstage, a system was trembling on the verge of exposure. I sat near the back of the room, eyes tracking Cheryl's every familiar gesture. I had seen that look before, the way she gazed at others like the world was her personal stage. I opened my laptop, connected to a private virtual network. The clock read 7:46 p.m. An IRS agent quietly texted me, "All teams in position, ready to trigger." I said nothing. I typed the single command, hands steady, $execute, dandelion trigger, xbatch_5.co, NF. The screen remained blank for 3 seconds. Then, wallet addresses began appearing line by line, flowing like a waterfall of numbers. Money streams from Cyprus, Serbia, Latvia, all became readable. Each line had a transaction ID, timestamp, and source address. Inside Tetra Pay's own auditing system, alerts started going off. A software engineer at their Chicago office checked the server remotely, then panicked and reported to management that the internal monitoring protocol had been reversed. In less than 3 minutes, the FBI had enough evidence to activate the search warrant. A wave of digital asset freeze orders was dispatched to banks. ICE and the IRS also deployed field inspection teams to 3 branch offices. Meanwhile, Cheryl was still holding the microphone, delivering a speech on ethical values in modern fintech. I stared at the stage, unblinking. She had no idea that between the lights and the applause, an operation was already sweeping away the empire she had built. And when the host read my name, Dr. Willow Brooks, everything moved into a phase that could no longer be undone. I stood up, walking between 2 federal agents. But I was no longer the woman who once hid in the shadows. I was the one carrying the data, the evidence, and the truth they had tried to bury for nearly a decade. I sat quietly in the front row, eyes locked on the stage where Cheryl held the microphone, her voice ringing out with confidence and pride. She spoke about her inspirational startup journey, about sleepless nights building her vision, about personal sacrifices in the pursuit of clean, fair technology. Every word that left her mouth was meticulously rehearsed, as if none of it had ever been a lie. The entire hall listened in silence, occasionally breaking into well-timed, polite applause. But in my ears, the only sound I heard was the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Not from nerves, but because something was about to end and something else was about to begin. An FBI agent approached the row where I was sitting. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just gave a subtle nod. The final signal. I blinked, sat up straight. On stage, Cheryl ended her speech with a familiar line, one she'd used often back when we used to work together. Let technology serve ethics, and let ethics guide technology. That line now sounded like an overplayed off-key song, and just as she handed the mic back to the MC, sudden movement came from both wings of the stage. 3 federal agents in plain clothes stepped forward with calm, deliberate strides. One approached the organizer's table and handed over a folder. Another flashed a badge under the spotlight. "We are representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Internal Revenue Service. We are here with an emergency arrest warrant for Mr. Leonard Diaz and Mr. Marshall Crane." The names of Tetra Pay's CFO and CTO rang out clearly into a room already wound tight of tension. Almost immediately, 2 men in tuxedos near the stage froze. One of them, Diaz, had been pouring a drink. His hand trembled, and the glass clinked against the bottle. The other man began to react, but an agent stepped forward, blocking his path. "Please cooperate. You are aware of the contents of the warrant. Counsel may be contacted after." No one shouted. No handcuffs were drawn, but the room felt like it had turned to ice. Cheryl remained on stage, the spotlight still cast on her face, her expression stunned. Her skin had gone pale, and she clutched the microphone tightly, as if it could somehow keep everything from collapsing beneath her feet. I didn't move. One of the event staff stepped onto the stage, trying to maintain composure, and spoke into the mic. We will pause the program briefly due to a technical matter. We kindly ask everyone to remain seated. While security quietly escorted the two key figures of Tetrapay out of the room, a sound. Technician dimmed the stage lights. But as the room darkened, a new light suddenly turned and shone on me. I hadn't asked for it. The MC, holding a printed list, glanced toward the wings, then stepped back to the microphone with a slight look of confusion. Next on our list of honorees, we're proud to introduce a name that may not be familiar to the public, but is very well known in the world of cybersecurity and federal investigations. I knew I was about to be revealed. Please welcome Dr. Willow Brooks, advisor to multiple government agencies on non-traditional financial investigations, and the lead architect behind a recent operation that helped dismantle one of the most sophisticated money laundering networks in the country. The spotlight followed me step by step as I stood and walked toward the stage. I didn't need to look around to feel the hundreds of eyes now fixed on me. Some stunned, some awkward, some simply confused by what was unfolding. Cheryl was still standing there. She hadn't left. As I neared, she took a half step back, her eyes still unfocused. I stopped in front of her. I didn't speak, didn't bow. I simply gave her a small, formal nod. She looked at me, lips slightly pressed. "It's you?" she asked quietly, almost as if asking herself more than me. I said nothing. I accepted the medal from a senior federal agent, who didn't say much, just gave me a brief, weighted look that needed no explanation. I stood at center stage, facing the audience. Down below, the judges and esteemed guests sat in stunned silence, as if frozen by something heavy and unseen. I knew some of them had once shaken Cheryl's hand, praised her, admired her, unaware that every one of those handshakes might have carried the residue of a rotting machine beneath the surface. The microphone came back on. The MC tried to keep his voice steady. "We'd also like to announce that full details of this operation will be released officially tomorrow morning at the Department of Justice press conference. Once again, congratulations to Dr. Willow Brooks." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My presence here said everything that needed to be said. I stepped down from the stage slowly, medal in hand. As I passed, Cheryl still frozen in place. I didn't look her way, but I heard a breath catch behind me. Not sobbing, not rage. It was the sound of someone realizing that the throne they stood on for years had been built from someone else's stone. And now, that foundation had crumbled. I returned to the front row. A few guests shifted aside to make space. Some nodded politely, uncertain of how to restart a conversation they never imagined would be necessary. I sat down, rested my hands on my lap, my back straight, no deep breath, no release, because I knew this wasn't a moment of rest. It was just a bridge between longer, deeper chapters of a war I had already been quietly fighting for years. They just hadn't seen it. The side conference room, tucked behind the main hall, was soundproofed, its lighting soft like early morning mist. I stood facing the frosted glass window, watching the parking lot below as cars slowly trickled out, quiet as birds after a feast. The door behind me opened. I didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The familiar scent of perfume, the controlled urgency of high heels, undeniable signs. Cheryl stood a few steps away, her once regal teal gown dulled under the yellow lighting. She didn't speak right away. I could hear her breathing slow and measured, bracing herself to stay composed. I turned, met her eyes no longer mocking or dismissive like 10 years ago, not yet regretful either. More like a swirl of confusion, resentment, and a growing panic barely hidden beneath the surface. "You humiliated me in front of the entire industry," Cheryl said, her voice low and sharp. "Doesn't that make you happy?" I paused, then walked over to the round table in the center of the room, pulled out a chair, and sat. "You're not humiliated because I exposed you," I replied, eyes on hers. "You're humiliated because it took you this long to realize you've been living off someone else's mind." She froze, her expression faltering. Her lips pressed together, then parted with a short, unnatural laugh. "You think what you did today can erase what I built? I still hold controlling shares." I can still recover. You've always believed everything you had came from strategy and personal grit, I said, my hands resting on the table. But from day one, you were wrong. The proposals had your signature. The lines of code carried your name. But the brainpower didn't live in the name printed on the contract. Cheryl looked at me, not angry, but as if searching for a denial, a lifeline to hold on to. But I gave her nothing. I pulled a thin file from my jacket pocket and placed it on the table. The FBI logo was stamped on, the top left corner, the red seal still fresh. "What's this?" she asked, her voice already fraying at the edges. "Supplemental evidence," I replied. "Related to covert transfers from the side project labeled GZ04 to a chain of cold wallets in Eastern Europe." Cheryl lunged forward, snatching the file and flipping through it in a rush. Her eyes froze on a single line. The transfer date, the account code, and the familiar set of initials written in the style only she had ever used. I didn't directly authorize it," she whispered. I looked her straight in the eyes. "But you knew, and you stayed silent." The door opened again. 2 agents stepped inside. No introductions needed this time. One walked over to the table and placed a brown envelope down. "We don't yet have grounds for criminal charges," one of them said, his tone neither sharp nor soft. "However, the new evidence has opened a secondary line of investigation. If you cooperate, the penalty may be reduced to a civil infraction requiring restitution and a ban on holding executive roles in the finance sector." Cheryl said nothing. The agent continued, "If you refuse, we'll escalate to federal-level prosecution with full authority." She stared at the envelope like it held her final sentence. "You have 72 hours to respond." The agents left the room quietly, leaving the agreement behind. The soft click of the closing door landed like a heavy full stop. Cheryl sat down across from me. No more arrogance. No masks. She ran a hand through her hair, fingers trembling, eyes fixed on the paper without truly reading it. "You planned all of this, didn't you?" "Not for revenge," I said. "To end it." She looked up, her face conflicted. "I used to think you were too weak to fight back. I was weak because I needed to survive. Because I needed money for Mom's medication. But not because I didn't know how I was being used." "Cheryl." I slowly nodded, as if finally seeing her own past laid bare with no more room to hide. "I could have done things differently," she said softly. "But I didn't." I stood, walking toward the door. "You still have 72 hours. What you do with them is up to you," I said, hand on the knob. "But if you really want to change, at least this time, be honest." I opened the door, letting in the light from the hallway. I stepped out without looking back. But I knew behind me, a woman now sat in a silent room, facing the very choices she once forced others to live with. And no one was standing still to take the fall for her anymore. I stood outside the old house in the suburbs of Des Moines, Iowa, the makeshift base of my childhood, the place where I used to shut my bedroom door to block out comparisons, where I learned to stay quiet because my name was never the one called to the front of the dinner table. That evening, the sky was gray and thick, the wind slipping through my collar. The snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air held that breathless stillness that always comes before it does. I heard the latch click open. Then Mom appeared, not in her usual nightgown, but wearing the light blue cardigan I had bought her years ago for Christmas, a gift she'd never worn until now. "Willow," she said gently, as if afraid to break the fragile air hanging between us on the porch. I nodded. No smile, no retreat. We stared at each other for a few seconds. Then she stepped aside and left the door open. Dad was sitting at the dinner table. His hair had grown more silver, his back slightly hunched, but the figure was unmistakable, the man who used to read the morning paper as I tiptoed down the stairs in high school. Dinner was simple. No flowers, no candles, no wine. Just chicken stew, garlic bread, and a bit of salad, like she still remembered I never ate fries at night. I sat down. No one spoke for a while. Just the sound of spoons tapping against porcelain and the heater humming faintly from the corner of the kitchen. Eventually, Dad looked up, His eyes met mine, not avoiding, not proud like in years past. "We owe you an apology," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen. "We believed Cheryl. We thought she was the one destined to succeed. And you were just the nice cousin tagging along." I didn't respond right away. Not because I hadn't forgiven them, but because I needed them to keep going, speaking from their hearts, not guilt. Mom set down her knife, her thin hands clenching together. "The day Cheryl announced you'd been let go, we didn't even ask why. We just thought Willow must have done something wrong. Because to us, Cheryl was always right." I put my bread down. "Did you know I was drowning in student debt then? I worked day and night, writing code, drafting proposals for her company. I couldn't even make it to your doctor appointments on time." Mom was silent, her eyes brimming. Dad let out a slow breath, hand tightening around his glass. "I never blamed you for not being rich," I continued, voice steady but firm. "I only blamed you for making my effort invisible. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked what dreams I had. They only asked, 'How far has Cheryl gone now?'" The room stilled. Then Dad's voice came, husky. "Are you happy, Willow?" That question struck me not because it was surprising, but because in 30 years no one had ever asked me that. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "I don't live for anyone's approval anymore. I don't measure happiness by family pride or praise from strangers. But if you're asking whether I'm living true to myself, then yes, I am." Mom wiped her tears and reached for my hand, hesitant. "Do you think we can start over?" I squeezed her hand gently. Starting over doesn't mean erasing what happened. But if we're going to move forward, the one condition is, this: you have to see me for who I am now. I'm not a little girl waiting for someone's approval. If you want to keep me in your life, you have to learn to listen." Dad nodded slowly, as if each nod carried years of unspoken words. We sat together for another hour, not needing to say much, just being present. Behind me on the shelf, a faded photo of me at age 10 caught the light. The glass was dusty, but the girl in the picture stared straight into the camera unafraid. Back then, I didn't yet understand how cruel silence could be. Now I know. Sometimes, a single genuine question can soften even the hardest of years. That day, the auditorium was vast and overwhelming, with lights cascading from the towering ceiling like artificial constellations illuminating the main stage. This year's Global Security Conference was held in San Francisco, drawing hundreds of leaders from the finance and tech sectors, government representatives from across the globe, and thousands of cybersecurity experts from every corner of the world. My name was displayed prominently on the giant screen. Dr. Willow Hartley, Chair of the Alliance for Decentralized Payment System Security, keynote speaker. Beneath it, a short description read, "Creator of the Whisper Protocol, the game-changing technology in international financial security." Just reading that, I felt my heartbeat slow, like I'd crossed a long, brutal stretch without losing myself. I wasn't dressed to impress. A muted ash-gray gown, my hair tied neatly, and a small dandelion-shaped hair clip I'd carried with me since the days I made a living typing documents for hire. Under the stage lights, no one could tell it was a cheap trinket from a secondhand store in Iowa. But to me, it was a reminder that softness, too, can be a form of resilience. When I stepped onto the stage, camera shutters clicked rapidly, followed by a sustained round of applause. But my eyes landed on a familiar face. Seated in the far left section, near the back of the hall, Cheryl. She sat alone. No entourage, no glow of a prestigious CEO. Her light brown, wavy hair was still styled the same, but she looked smaller, like someone crushed under the weight of what they once built and then lost. I wasn't surprised to see her there. She had always found a way into any room where power gathered. I opened my talk with a short story about an anonymous code snippet that once helped the FBI dismantle a chain of illegal transactions in under 7 hours. The code had no listed author, only a tag, Dandelion, 73. The room fell silent, then erupted into waves of applause. I continued, presenting our layered security model, the Whisper Protocol, and how we were designing a system where privacy and transparency could coexist, neither canceling the other out. Every time I spoke of ethical responsibility in tech design, I could feel Cheryl's gaze fixed on me. Not with hatred, but with a quiet, it struggled to understand how someone once deemed invisible was now being heard by the world. When I concluded my talk, the entire hall rose to their feet. The applause wasn't just from scholars or corporate executives, but also from the young engineers lined up along the edges of the stage, laptops in hand, eyes glowing with the belief that quiet intellect could still make a thunderous impact. I stepped down and walked toward the backstage. But before I could take 3 steps, someone gently touched my sleeve. Cheryl stood there. She didn't smile. She didn't speak at first. Then softly she said, "You're not a shadow anymore." I looked at her. "I never was. You just didn't want to see me." She nodded, her eyes no longer calculating, no longer arrogant, just tired and tinged with regret. "I used to think you were just skilled," she said, her voice lower now. "I never imagined you had vision." I didn't respond. I no longer needed praise from someone who once stole my voice. "I used to think power was standing on the highest stage, speaking to the world, being chased by the press," Cheryl continued. "But today, sitting down there, watching everyone rise for you, I understood something. Real power is when people stand because they believe in what you're doing." I was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you come here just to say that?" She shook her head. "No, I came to listen, because for the past 10 years, all I've done is speak in control." I exhaled, gently. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't sympathy. Just the awareness that some people spend a lifetime learning the cost of dismissing others. "I'm not going to erase the past," I said, meeting her eyes. "Because that past made me stronger. But I don't need it to prove anything anymore." Cheryl's eyes brimmed with tears. "You don't need my forgiveness," she said. "But if someday you're open to talking again as professionals, I'd be honored." I didn't answer, just gave a small nod, not agreement, but respect for the process of self-reflection she had begun. As I turned and walked toward the backstage elevator, the sound of the audience still echoed faintly through the hall, not because they knew who I once was, but because now they saw who I had become. And to me, that was the most complete form of justice, not fueled by rage, but by a presence that could no longer be ignored. Back in my small apartment on the west side of Seattle, I slipped off my heels and placed my bag on the worn armchair by the window. Outside, a light mist settled over the treetops, like a quiet veil reminding me that no matter how grand something is, it always ends in stillness. This apartment wasn't luxurious, but every detail was intentional. Soft ash-gray walls, warm yellow lighting, a wooden bookshelf carefully lined with texts on security, programming, and philosophy. Nothing excessive. Nothing. For show. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and walked to the desk by the window. On it sat a thin, old wooden box. I opened the lid, flipped through a few photos, and paused at one that had yellowed with time. In it, I stood behind Cheryl, dressed in a pale business dress, eyes slightly lowered, holding a thick folder. The crowd around us clapped, celebrating Cheryl's triumph in a tech deal worth hundreds of millions. She beamed under the spotlight, and me, I was just a blurred shape in the background. I stared at the photo for a long time, as if trying to see myself through the eyes of someone else. Back then, I believed that if I kept my head down and worked hard, the world would eventually recognize my worth. But no, the world doesn't operate on fairness. Truth gets twisted, effort gets labeled with someone else's name, and recognition always goes to those who know how to stand in the spotlight when it turns on. I reached into the drawer for a lighter, brought the flame to the edge of the photo. It caught quickly, rising into a small but searing fire. In the thin line of smoke, Cheryl's face disappeared first, and then even my shadow behind her turned to ash. I let the charred remains fall into a ceramic dish, then gently set my tea down. No more bitterness, no more hunger for validation, just closure. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up with a string of code I had been working on for months. Project Oasis, a multi-layered encryption system. Open source, created specifically for nonprofit organizations, humanitarian rescue teams, and investigative journalists working in conflict zones. I wanted to build a platform where anyone facing danger could exchange information safely, without surveillance, without dependence on any tech giant. This wasn't paid work. No one was giving me money, and no one was calling me on stage to applaud this. But I felt free, a kind of freedom I'd never fully known after all those years spent in someone else's shadow. I resumed writing the interface layer of Oasis, each line of code like a steady breath, grounding me in my own rhythm. I reviewed the multi-layer encryption algorithms, adjusted response speeds for low-bandwidth connections, added self-destruct features for unauthorized access attempts. When I reached the part where I had to input the author's name, I sat for a long time, staring at the blinking cursor. In the past, I'd always left it blank or signed off with aliases. Whisperer, Ghost 43, Ashleaf. I was afraid of being found out. Afraid that Cheryl or someone else from that past might discover I was still here, still creating things they never understood. But today, I typed each letter slowly, with purpose. Author, Willow Hartley. No more anonymity. Not because I crave praise, but because I have no reason to hide from what I've built anymore. After saving the first build, I looked out the window and saw raindrops begin to fall, gently. Each one a reminder that even the quietest things, with persistence, can bring about change. My phone buzzed beside me. An email had just arrived from a humanitarian organization in Colombia. They said they were looking for a secure tool for their team collecting human rights violation evidence along the border, and asked if I could help configure the system. I typed my reply. I'll send you a working prototype within 48 hours. No fees, no conditions. I hit send, then leaned back in my chair. A few years ago, I thought the greatest victory of my life would be seeing Cheryl exposed. When the FBI handed her those documents, when she stood frozen in that auditorium, when she looked at me like I was someone she never really knew. But it turns out, the real victory is in moments like this when I don't need anyone's approval, when there's no one left to fight against, and no one standing above me. I stood, pulled a thin blanket over my shoulders, and stepped out onto the small balcony. The air was cold, but in a good way. From this height, I could see the streetlights twinkling like a river of light through a city that never truly sleeps. Below were thousands, maybe millions of people fighting for dreams of their own. Some would be overlooked, some would be robbed of credit, but some would step out of the shadows on their own terms, leaving behind a mark that no one could erase. I didn't need a title. I didn't need a thank you. But at least now, I knew the name Willow Hartley was no longer tied to obedience or silence. It was tied to choice, to truth, to real work, and to a life no one else gets to define for me. What would you do if one day, the person who once dismissed you had to sit in silence, watching your success, a success you built without their approval? Would you forgive? Or would you keep walking like I did quietly, but with your head held high? I didn't take revenge through anger. I need to raise my voice to prove I was right. I simply chose to exist clearly, firmly, and no longer hidden behind anyone else's name. Because to me, showing up fully is the most beautiful answer of all. And you, if you've ever been overlooked, ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to love you most, what would you do to rise without losing who you are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll read every single one, because I believe somewhere out there are many like me learning how to step out of old shadows and live a life that truly reflects who they are. And if you want to keep walking with me through stories about family, dignity, forgiveness, and the truths we never dared to tell, hit follow. There's more waiting to come into the light, not for revenge, but for healing. See you in the next story.